So, friends, we are going to discuss about another unit in that sense, that is unit 6, and it is on forms of sanitation and their social implications. I think we have talked in detail about the various aspects of research methodology. We have tried to speak about the various meanings and definitions, and apart from that I think we try to have the grounding of what the sanitation is. Now, let us say we try to understand that how the forms of sanitation in that sense can be seen. And I think when we try to speak about that, we are speaking about the different scope in that sense in which the sanitation can interfere. And most important in that sense of course is it will speak about the linkage of sanitation with other issues. I think the very basic thing in that sense which we have to focus upon is the issue of sanitation and science. I think we have talked about this particular issue in the initial phase, that how we have to make sanitation a science. And the most important thing in that sense is that we have to speak about the practical sanitation in terms of its utility, in terms of its consideration for its validity in the society, and that of course is going to be the scientific aspect of any hygiene, and that is where we try to locate the idea of sanitary science. But the most important thing in that sense is that whenever we try to speak about the scientific investigation, the important in that sense is the issue of verification. We have to speak about the various forms of disease in that sense, and how we are going to see it in a very technical sense. I think we try to speak about the biological problems which are associated with the analysis, which sometimes try to demean the consideration of the societal component. So, we have to see that we have to deploy the experimental methods, we have to speak about the specific cases in that sense which are not medical listed cases in that sense, but definitely I think public hygiene in that sense is going to be important because it is seen as an interface between the science and society. So, we try to see the experimental method which has to be used basically when we try to see the applied aspect of the sanitary question, and we have to deal with the issue of public hygiene which is seen as an interface between the science and society. And for that I think we have to speak about the various direct and indirect method. So, that way I think we have to see that sanitation and science in that sense has a common linkage. Either it is the question of addressing certain disease like typhoid, cholera or tuberculosis for that sake, or we have certain other issues. I think it has some societal bearing, and that we have to keep in mind when we are trying to speak about that. So, definitely one form of understanding in that sense is the science and sanitation. Another of course is the role of the state. So, we have the linkage between the state and sanitation as another aspect of sanitation, and when we try to speak about the state and sanitation, the basic idea in that sense of course is what are the various efforts of the state government in order to prevent the insanitary conditions, unhygienic conditions in that sense which are required for the society. But the important thing is that we have to speak about certain things which are basically related to the efforts of the men's environment in order to make the minimal cause for the disease, and that is where we try to see that the main problem here is that how the man can keep himself secure in terms of the food and the drink, the sort of contamination which is involved, how he can overcome that. And for that I think we try to speak about in the historical perspective of sanitation, that how the state were gradually interfering into various aspects, and we try to see that in 1907 we try to speak about the Sanitary Water System Act, which was basically meant for the Public Health Act also. So, we try to see that in 1915 when we try to speak about the Bureau of Sanitary Engineering under the State Board of Health, we try to see that there is certain assemblage between the state and the sanitation, and for that we have to see that it involves various aspects in that sense, trying to speak about the health and comfort of the people, the police power which of course is inherent in the government, and how they try to look after that particular thing. And we have to see that it is the time when the Magna Carta in that sense is trying to speak about that how the race has to be preserved, and for that I think the most important thing is that safeguarding them from the so called sanitation in sanitary condition or unhygienic conditions, and that is where we try to see that the role of the state in that sense is going to be crucial. And apart from that we also try to speak about certain services which tries to represent the masculine and feminine element of the government, and the best part in that sense of course is that both of them are to be served, and that is where we try to see that it has to be net balance for both masculine and the feminine, and the state has to be the neutral player. And the function of the state health department in that sense has to be seen in terms of how the legislature in that sense is going to be crucial in order to understand the sort of nuances which are to be seen as part and parcel of the authority. So, the authority is to be seen as a matter of certain amount of arrangements like the court, we have to have the talk testimony, we have to have certain decisions in that sense, and the state department of health in that sense, police power in that sense are to be seen as an important aspect apart from the question of inspection, the supply of water, the steam pollution in that sense, all these things how they are going to be taken into consideration. And especially we try to speak about the issue of food sanitation and the sophistication of the drugs in that sense, or the sophistication of the sickness. All these things comes under the broader umbrella of the state and the sanitation. Another important aspect which is directly indirectly related to this particular issue is the sanitation and health, although it also can fall into the broader domain of the state, but somewhere we try to see that sanitation and health can go together, and for that the basic understanding is that the public health is basically meant to improve the health of the people, and that is the basic idea whereby we try to minimize the environmental hazards. And the important aspect in that sense is that we try to build up the healthy neighborhood, and for that the most important thing in that sense is that we try to speak about how the market development does not allow the population to function, and what is the role of the state in that sense to intervene into these processes. And we basically try to speak about that the public health which exists in terms of improving the health of the people has to be seen in a serious way. And despite various planning, sometimes we try to find that health for all is seen as an utopia. So, I think the concern is more towards how we can make it into practice, and it is basically the role of the government in that sense, which is basically helpful in providing the issue of the healthy citizenship. And that is where I think we try to see that the question of the budgetary provisions, we try to speak about the question of how things are to be seen in terms of education, in terms of awareness, or in terms of employment. All these things in that sense are going to be quite crucial when we try to speak about these particular aspect. And then I think we also try to indulge into the basic understanding of not only the eradication of the specific disease, but also our priority has to be more towards the issue of family planning, public health services, and also trying to see it in terms of how to reduce the exposure to the disease, and that of course is the bigger agenda which the government has to see. And in that framework we have to see that it can be seen as we have to speak about the hygiene and the cattle keeping practices, cleaning the irrigation canals in that sense, and trying to avoid the vector breedings. These are the things in that sense which has to be taken into consideration when we try to speak about the health and the sanitation. And that is where we try to see the question of epidemic which may occur has to be safeguarded by the intervention of the state, and that is where we have to see that health and sanitation in that sense has something to do with how they are going to be effective in terms of the healthy citizenship. And the basic idea in that sense of course is it is not only the question of putting the budget, but it is also providing the health services in that sense in the real sense, so that one can really prevent the disease. And then I think we try to speak about within that broader framework, we can also speak about the concern for the rural sanitation. And this rural sanitation, as the term itself indicate, it is basically trying to speak about certain specific arrangements in that sense. I think we try to speak about the fact that there has been the parallel conditions in that sense which have been there, and we try to speak about either it is the developing or the developed nations. There is always the possibility that the rural in that sense is going to be more affected in terms of the so called health, and we have to see that how the health and sanitation has to be percolated to the issue of the rural sanitation. And I think that is where we have to see that how we can overcome the basic understanding of the typhoid fever or the specific disease which can be turned into a pandemic has to be controlled. And then I think we try to speak about another form of sanitation in terms of the food sanitation, and when we try to speak about that, the basic idea is that we have to do with how to have the hygienic food. That of course is the basic assumption, but when we try to speak about the food sanitation program, we are basically trying to speak about the federal food and the drug law which has to be implemented. We try to speak about the positions of the work of the Food and the Drug Administration. We have to speak about the Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act of 1938, or we try to speak about various sanitary food which are strictly speaking in terms of providing certain aspect of one can say the good health conditions is going to be the basic thumb rule. And we try to see that the Food and the Drug Act of 1906 which defined the food as adulteration, if we try to see that it is the whole or the part which of course is filthy, decomposed or food for the odd conditions, this may lead to the change in the conditionality of food. So, we have to have certain basic legal basis in that sense for the food sanitation programs, and for that I think the most important thing in that sense is that we have to see the efforts of the government in that sense, that how food sanitation can be seen as an important agenda for speaking about the concern for the citizenship. And then I think we can speak about moving to a sort of a personalization. We can speak about the household sanitation as another important framework in which the whole concern is that we are shifting from what I can say the public sphere to the private sphere, and the basic idea in that sense of course is that we have to speak about the healthful homes, and the accuracy in that sense has to be taken into consideration. We can speak about how the concern for women in that sense has to be represented, how they have to be given due space with regard to what one can say the issue of home sanitation. And the basic idea in that sense is that we have to speak about the family life, where the concern is more towards the question of decision making. We can speak about the conditionality in which the slum conditions are to be minimized. We can speak about the proper water supply, which has to be seen in terms of the safe and adequate water supply, which of course is the primary requirement for the healthful living. And we have to see that it also involves certain amount of excreta disposal, which has to be seen in terms of the indoor toilets. And our concern in that sense of course is that in order to make or keep the household sanitation clean, the basic idea in that sense of course is that we have to have the effective excreta disposal, and then we have to have the refuse disposal, which is basically seen in terms of what one can say how to minimize the understanding of dampness or the low temperature in that sense, or we try to speak about certain conditionalities in a sense that where the watertight arrangements can be made through which the refuse disposal can take place. And then we can speak about the issue of light and the fresh air, which again is equally important when we try to speak about the so called household sanitation. And the whole idea in that sense of course is it basically deals with that aspect which sometimes speaks about the arrangement of the floor, the arrangement of the roof, the size of the room in that sense. All these things in that sense are going to be important. And then I think the plumbing condition which speak about the drainage pipes in that sense, how and where it has to be kept, the obstructions, how they have to be overcome, and the most important in that sense of course is that we have to see that the proper disposal in that sense are to be represented when we try to speak about that particular aspect. So, we try to see that we also have to safeguard the issue of accident prevention, which of course is sometimes related to the poor conditionalities, the locations in that sense, the setting, and for that we have to have the improvement in the heating and the cooking devices. We have to have the proper electric fittings in that sense. All these things in that sense can reduce the accident prevention, and that is where we try to see that the so called household sanitation in that sense has to deal with. And then I think we try to see certain legality in that sense which are associated with sanitation, and for that we try to speak about that law and sanitation which plays a crucial role in terms of understanding the sanitation. I think somewhere we try to speak about that the great cities which has been badly administered has to be seen in a very different way, and we have to speak about the fact that the police power in that sense has to be given the upper hand. But the most important thing in that sense of course is the conditionality of the court in that sense, the conditionality of the legal system which is going to be equally important. And within that framework we try to speak about that what are the various policies in that sense or certain legal enactment which are been designed by the High Court and the Supreme Court, and they are going to be an important marker for effective implementation of these policies. Like when we try to speak about certain issues, we try to speak about the fact that the various conferences or events which are related to the population and development are seen in terms of the dialogue, but the whole idea in that sense of course is when we try to see it in terms of implementation, we have to focus upon the concern for legal measures, in that sense how effective they are, and within that framework we try to speak about certain rights. In that sense, we can speak about what you can say the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, that of course is the larger global body. We can speak about certain concerns which are related to right to water in that sense, or we can speak about the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social and the Cultural Rights. So, all these aspects in that sense are going to be seen as important conventions or the provisions which are legally laid, and for that if you try to see, the very first thing in that sense of course is the Convention on the Right of the Child 1989, which comes under the Article 24, and the basic idea in that sense of course is that it tries to speak about how the state party recognize the right of the child to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health. And apart from that, we have to see it in terms of how it is going to have its implementation as a right in terms of the legal arrangements. In that sense, we have also to speak about the various provisions through which there is the combatement of the disease and malnutrition, which has to be part and parcel of the primary health care, and these are certain things in that sense which have to be taken into consideration. Similarly, we try to speak about Article 27, which tries to speak about that the state parties recognizes the right of every child to be a standard of living adequate for the child's physical, mental and spiritual concern, apart from the moral and the social development. So, we basically try to see that the conventions are basically meant for bringing about certain transformation in the conditionality of the child, and along with that I think the Convention on Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, that was 1979, which is coming under the Article 14, has to be taken into consideration. We try to speak about that the state parties in that sense gave due emphasis to eliminate the discrimination against the women in the rural areas, in order to ensure that they are being treated equally in terms of the gender relations, and we have to see that how the women's right in that sense are being safeguarded. We are basically trying to speak about how they enjoy the adequate living conditions, particularly in relation to the housing, sanitation, electricity and water supply. All these things in that sense are going to be important. And then I think we try to speak about the general rights in terms of International Convention on Economic, Social and the Cultural Right of 1966, and in that we try to see in Article 1, all peoples may have their own ends, freely dispose of their natural wealth and resources without prejudice and to any obligations, and that of course is one important aspect that has to be taken into consideration, that in no case may a people be deprived of their own means of subsistence. So, it basically tries to give certain opportunities in terms of the social, economic and cultural, which is to be given to the individual. Then Article 2, which tries to speak about the fact that each state party, which of course is to be seen as individual in that sense, has to have certain arrangements with regard to the international assistance and cooperation, and we basically try to see that the whole idea in that sense of course is that how the legislative measures in that sense are to safeguard the issues related to that. We speak about that state parties who are party to that providing a guarantee in terms of putting the people without any discrimination based on the language, religion, polity, sex or for that sake the national. All these things in that sense are given are to be given the free hand, and that of course is the basic concern which we try to see in terms of the economic, social and the cultural rights. And then Article 11, which tries to specify the fact that we have to speak about the right of everyone in terms of the specific standard of living for himself and his family. I think the basic idea here is that it has to supplement the adequate food, clothing, housing and the continuous improvement of the living conditions, and the state parties in that sense should be in a position to provide the legal measures with regard to that. And then I think Article 12, which tries to speak about the right of everyone to be seen in terms of highest attainment of the standard of physical and the mental health. And we try to see that these aspects in that sense, in terms of the specific convention in that sense, are going to be made more fruitful. We try to speak about the improvement in all aspects of the environmental and the industrial hygiene. We try to speak about the restoration, the reduction of the birth rate in that sense, or the infant mortality rate, or we try to speak about the creation of the conditions which are basically meant for all medical services. All these things in that sense are going to bring about a certain amount of ease with regard to the citizenship in that sense, and that of course is one important aspect related to this particular issue. Then I think we try to speak about the Geneva Convention 3, which is basically relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, and that was basically implemented in 1949. And under Article 20, it tries to say that the detaining power shall supply the prisoners of war who are being evacuated with sufficient food and potable water, and with the necessary clothing and the medical attention. So, I think that provision is inbuilt even with the prisoners, and we try to see that Article 26, which tries to give about the fact that the basic daily food grain rations has to be sufficiently given in terms of quality and quantity, and the prisoners of the war should be put into the good health, and they should avoid the prevent loss of weight in terms of their nutritional deficiency. I think there also the prisoners of war in that sense are also even given legally certain provisions, whereby I think the conditionality of health in that sense should not be compromised. And then I think Article 29, which basically try to speak about all sanitary measures necessary to ensure the cleanliness and healthfulness of the camps and to prevent them from epidemic, and also the prisoners of war shall have for their daily use and for the convenience all sort of the rules of hygienes whatsoever they are needing for the cleanliness, and the camps are to be put in such a fashion that even the women prisoners of the war are accommodated. There should be separate provisions for them, and also I think there should be proper facilities for the baths and the showers. So, we basically try to see that the basic amenities which are needed for sanitation in that sense are to be put into consideration when we try to speak about even the prisoners of war. So, I think the layman citizens in that sense definitely should have all these rights which are being taken into consideration. Now, we try to speak about the international declaration and the resolution which is basically meant for providing certain amount of political commitment, and the whole idea in that sense is that there is a program of action of the international conference where the population and the development agendas are fixed, and what are the basic things which has been part of this resolution, which took place initially in 1977, and gradually the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, which came in 1992. We basically try to see that this declaration requires the state to carry out the number of specific actions which includes the improving water quality, that is one. We try to speak about the access to the water and sanitation, that is another important aspect, and also trying to see the inequality in health status with regard to the developed and the developing nation, that is another important aspect. And then we try to speak about the access to the water for the older persons, and apart from that I think certain other measures which are indirectly related includes the adequate environment for all. And apart from that I think the basic human needs and the protection of ecosystem, all these things are to be safeguarded, and that way if you try to see the whole idea in that sense of course is that it tries to give emphasis upon the issue of sanitation, it tries to focus upon the basic thing with regard to the maintenance of the environmental conditions in that sense, and also the dignity of an individual. And then I think we try to speak about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was in 1948, and within that in Article 2 it was specifically emphasizing upon the fact that everybody is entitled to all the rights and freedom which are being set forth for the declaration, and it is basically been assumed that one's own entitlement in that sense has to be served. Similarly, Article 7, which tries to focus upon the fact that all are equal before the law, and we should not make a discrimination based on certain laws in that sense. And apart from that, Article 25, which gives due emphasis upon the right to the standard of living in terms of adequate health and the well-being of himself and his family in terms of the food, housing and the necessary social services. And then I think we try to speak about the Article 28, which deals with the social and the international order to have the rights and freedom which are to be put forth for the individuals in the wider sense. And then I think we try to speak about another important declaration, that is the Stockholm Declaration, which was the United Nations conference held in on human environment in 1972. And the basic principle, the principle 1, which tries to emphasize upon the fact that man has the fundamental rights to the freedom, equality and adequate conditions of life. And there I think the concern is more towards to permit a life of dignity and the well-being. That of course is the major agenda, and the principle 2 basically tries to reflect upon the natural resources, the use of that in terms of the air, water, land, flora and fauna, and all these things in that sense are to be safeguarded. And apart from that, I think the standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners, they are to be taken into consideration, and apart from that the personal hygiene has to be given due emphasis. So, we try to see that the personal hygiene, the food are to be seen as important aspect. Even when we try to speak about the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development that took place in 1992, we try to speak about the basic principle 1, which tries to focus upon the fact that the center of concern should be the sustainable development. So, we have to see that they are the entitlement for the healthy and the productive life in terms of their harmony with the nature, and the principle 10, which tries to speak about that how the participation of all concerned citizenship has to be seen in a drastic way. And the basic idea in that sense is that they have to speak about certain issues which tries to encourage the public awareness and participation in terms of having the information about certain judicial and the administrative proceedings, and also their rights over the participation and in terms of maintenance of the sustainable development. So, that is how we try to see the concern goes, and we have also the habitat agenda which comes under the United Nations Habitat second conference which happened at Istanbul in 1996, and in that the paragraph 129 tries to speak about that the health problem related to the environmental conditions, it includes the lack of access to the safe water and sanitation, how they have to be taken into consideration. And we have to see that the contribution of the society has to be seen in terms of providing that particular benefit. It is to be seen as an integrative approach to the provision of environmental and the sound infrastructure to the individuals, that is going to be an important aspect. And then we quickly can speak about the Johannesburg plan of implementation of the World Summit on Sustainable Development in 2002, and there I think the important aspect in that sense which has been thrown or which has been focused upon is to achieve the Millennium Development Goal, that is the MDGs, and within that we have the provision for the safe drinking water which has to be attained by 2015, but now it has been extended, and we try to see that it tries to focus upon the access to the basic sanitation and the other provisions which can be part and parcel of the Millennium Development Goal. And then I think we can speak about another important aspect of sanitation, that is the midwifery and the sanitation, which of course is seen as that how the midwifery is the science and art which for its object in terms of management of the women and her offsprings during the pregnancy is going to be important issue. And we basically try to see that the practice of midwifery is going to provide certain aspect of the actual birth of the child. It tries to speak about the advances in the sanitary knowledge which has to be provided in that sense, and apart from that how the patient can overcome certain disease in that sense. These are certain things which are part and parcel of this particular thing. And then I think we can also link the issue of sanitation as another form with regard to the conservation and sanitation. I think since we have spoken about the sustainability, conservation definitely plays a crucial role, and we basically try to see that conservation is something which is related to the common use and how we can have the limited use in terms of certain amount of control, that is going to be an important aspect. And for that the important thing is that we have to speak about the concern which happened. We try to speak about the issue of sanitation which of course is going to be an important aspect within that framework. And the best thing in that sense is that we try to speak about the standards of housing and the housing equipments which are going to be provided or to be facilitated. We try to speak about the disposal of the solid refuse or the garbage, and the responsibilities of those in sanitary works to have the conservation of the natural resources. All these things in that sense are part of the issue. And then I think quickly we can speak about the watershed sanitation. The watershed sanitation in that sense which of course is seen as another important element to have water supply arrangements in that sense, and that particular thing in that sense is to be seen as one important aspect whereby we can have the alternative source of reservoirs which are basically meant for the water supply. We can speak about certain issues which are made for having certain amount of provisions for the safe water, and in order to have the reservoir of water, these are certain things which can be talked about. And quickly we can speak about the appropriate technology and the modern sanitation. I think that is where we have to see, because since we are moving towards the scientific era, our concern is more towards that how the appropriate technology and the modern sanitation can go together. And when we try to speak about that, the whole idea in that sense is that we have to speak about the modern sanitation which tries to justify the statement that how the conditions which have been more deplorable has to be put into consideration. I think we try to speak about the issue of outbreak of infectious disease, which of course is going to be one important aspect, and we are basically trying to understand the things in terms of the proper sanitary methods which are to be enforced. And for that I think what is the need of the hour is that trying to have certain scientific temper, and it is basically that we can have the intelligent cooperations from the public in carrying forward the various sanitary practices. And for that we have to see that the public should not be seen as apathetic towards the basic arrangements which are being provided with regard to the public health work. And we have to see that the home in that sense has to be seen as a site where a certain amount of sanitary units in that sense are to be provided. The concern is that how the appropriate technologies in that sense are going to be important. I think here we can refer to the basic understanding of the drinking water and sanitation decade which emerged in 1891 to 1990, and we basically try to speak about, there have been several researches which tries to speak about that how we can have the good water and the sanitation concern in that sense. And here the most important aspect is that we have to have the low cost, slow and the fast filtration processes for the water treatments, the hand pumps, the on-site excreta disposal, using the composite pits, the toilets in that sense, and the excreta treatments. All these refuse in that sense are going to be seen as an important source for the biogas generation. And apart from that, the basic concern is towards the fish culture and to use of excreta as a crop fertilizer. I think when we try to speak about these aspects, then we can see that the understanding has to be seen that how our concern for sanitation has certain bearings, and these bearings in that sense has something to do with the environment. So, we have to see that when we try to speak about the international water and sanitation decade, we try to see that appropriateness of the technology in that sense is going to be important. I think we try to speak about the real health improvement which basically can be meant more for the rural in that sense, especially the villages in that sense, that is going to be important. And we have to see that there has to be certain provisions whereby there is a major shift in the institution and the approaches which is required in terms of emphasis on the water supply technology and also in terms of improvement in the health. So, the basic idea in that sense is that we have to speak about that how there has to be transfer of technology from urban to rural. At least I think we can say that APJ Abdul Kalam, our former president, was trying to emphasize upon the fact that how the urban infrastructures can be provided to the rural areas, and that is the broader statement which he says that which is normally called as the Pura, that is providing the urban infrastructure to the rural areas, and that is where we try to see the strength of the technology lies, that we have to speak about that how the technology has to be put to the grassroots, how it has to reach to the maximum in that sense, that of course is going to be an important aspect. And the most important aspect which we have to take into consideration is the issue of community participation. And I think when we try to speak about that, the community participation which is basically seen as an appropriate way for the water supply and the sanitation, we have to speak about the adequate water supplies in terms of how it is going to be seen as the portable drinking water. I think when we try to speak about this approach after the Second World War, we try to see that lot many things happen in terms of vector control, in terms of chemotherapy, or in terms of immunology, and how these things are going to be seen as having certain amount of control over the specific disease in that sense which has been there earlier. So, basically we try to speak about that the understanding of infection in that sense has been overcome with this technology, especially the environmental control strategies have been devised, whereby we can speak about the sophistication of the domestic water supplies and sanitation in terms of the use of technology. The basic concern in that sense of course is that we have to speak about the high level of international activities in the field of water supply and sanitation. And the most important thing in that sense is that we have to speak about that how the international drinking water supply and sanitation decade has to be taken into consideration. And the basic idea in that sense of course is that we have to speak about that the community participation in that sense is going to be the thumb rule. And the basic idea is that we have to speak about this particular provisions, whereby the community participation has to be seen in such a fashion that they have to virtually own it. If you have to quote the Robert Chambers statement that the last person in that sense has to get the benefits of the development, and if that is the scenario, then only we are trying to speak about the development in the real sense. So, the basic idea in that sense of course is that community participation has to be in such a fashion whereby we are in a position to provide the proper justification, to provide certain facilities in that sense which has to be given for the understanding of what you can say people in terms of their participation. And this community participation has to be holistic. It may include the children at the different level, it may include the men and the women, even the old age in that sense. All the peoples in that sense have to be part and parcel of the community participation. And the most important thing is that when we try to speak about that, then only we can speak about the feedback, we can speak about certain arrangement whereby the appropriateness of the technology in that sense is going to be meaningful. Like when we try to see that the beneficiary of the technology in that sense is not one, it is basically multiple. And we have to see that since there is a diversity in terms of gender, diversity in terms of the age, the diversity in terms of certain other parameters of region, of religion. So, we have to see that how much appropriate the water supply technology and sanitation technology is, so that it can benefit the maximum. And the basic idea in that sense of course is that we have to speak about that how we can have certain arrangements in that sense, especially when we try to speak about the contribution of United Nations in that sense, which is trying to provide the entire world population with the safe drinking water supply and the hygienic excreta disposal facilities. And when we try to speak about that, the basic idea in that sense of course is that that is the seen as one important arrangements which tries to provide or promote the safe drinking water and sanitation facilities. But the most important thing is that when we try to speak about the various forms of sanitation, the whole idea in that sense is that we have to speak about that how this form of sanitation in that sense has to be put differently. Now, let us say we have spoken about various aspects trying to have the various forms of sanitation. It was linked to certain issues, like we have tried to speak about the sanitation in terms of how it is related to the gender, how it is related to the legal in that sense, how it was related to the so called health, or how it was related to the rural, or how it was related to the environment. All these things in that sense are going to be quite crucial and critical, but the most important thing in that sense of course is that when we try to speak about the form of sanitation, the basic aspect in that sense of course is that we have to enhance the boundaries of the sanitation, and that of course is the basic idea of this particular unit in that sense. When we try to speak about the forms of sanitation, I think we have to cut across the different disciplinary boundaries. We have to speak about certain regions in that sense which are unexplored, which has not been part of sanitation, has to come into the picture. I think when we try to speak about the various acts and the provisions in that sense, in the legal sense, I think the whole idea in that sense of course is that in them also we try to see the presence of sanitation. So, we try to see even the case of midwifery and sanitation, which tries to emphasize upon the awareness with regard to the child rearing in that sense, or trying to have the awareness about the prevention of the disease. All these things in that sense plays a crucial role, and the basic idea in that sense of course is that we have to see that how this different aspect in that sense which we try to deal with had certain bearings on the understanding of sanitation. I think when we try to speak about that, the basic idea in that sense of course is that it is not something which is regional, it is not something which is local. We have to see that it has to be seen in the global framework. And what is the basic idea? The basic idea in that sense of course is that nothing has to be put at what you can say the micro level, everything has to be surfaced at the macro level, and the basic idea in that sense is that we have to speak about those provisions which are basically meant for bringing about certain transformation to the issue of the water and sanitation. And somewhere I think we try to see that it has to be seen in terms of some interdependent relationships. We should not confine the understanding simply based on the fact that these arrangements in that sense are not going to be made for a specific society. I think somewhere we have to see that there has to be net balance in terms of the distribution of the resources, either it is the underdeveloped countries or the developing countries or the developed. I think all of them had or they should require the minimum aspect of sanitation. And when we try to speak about the form of sanitation, the basic idea in that sense of course is that how and to what extent we should be in a position to provide or supplement certain important benefits to the people in that sense. And I think when we try to speak about the India, I think there are varied aspects in that sense which we have to take into consideration. I think we try to speak about the digital divide, which of course is seen as one important component. We try to speak about that how this digital divide in that sense is going to bring about the divide between the rural and the urban. But again I think if you try to see that this digital divide in that sense is creating the new nuances, we have to see the provisions through which we can overcome it. So, it is not the technology alone, it is the appropriateness of the technology which has to be seen. And the basic idea in that sense of course is I think technology has to be over and above the race, it has to be over and above the gender in that sense, and that of course should be seen as that technology should have the human face, because the basic idea in that sense of course is when we try to speak about the human face in that sense, the idea in that sense of course is that it tries to treat everybody equally irrespective of the specific biological arrangements in that sense. And we have to see that how the various components in that sense which have been dealt in this proceedings in that sense try to speak about the different facets of sanitation. I think when we try to speak about these issues, I think the most important thing is that we try to see that where is the boundary of sanitation. Somewhere it is difficult to see any area which is uncovered in that sense, which may not fall into the purview of sanitation, but the whole idea in that sense of course is that trying to enhance the boundary, like we try to speak about that rural has to be made urban, or for that sake we have to see that how we are going to make it. So, if we have the provisions of sanitation which are part and parcel of urban, and if the similar facilities and arrangements can be given to the rural population, then only we can speak about the real strength of the various forms. But the most important thing in that sense is that we have to speak about that how the concern for the population in that sense has to be taken into consideration. I think even we try to speak about that the prisoner of wars in that sense also has to be treated equally in terms of the issue of sanitation. They also should have the provision for providing the minimum supply of water, of the hygienic conditions, or the issue of cleanliness. All these things are to be maintained for them also. It means that it is not our citizenship alone which has to be benefited. It is not the state who is going to be seen as a funding agency or as a provider for the sanitation. Rather, it has to be for the human in general, and that human which has to be seen in terms of universal. The whole idea in that sense, of course, is that we have to speak about that how the human has to be seen across. We have to speak about the human as something which of course is going to be for the humanity, and in that way we try to see, as we progress towards the civilization, we have to see that the role of technology in that sense is going to be enhanced. We try to speak about the technology which is of course going to be bridging the people in that sense. We try to speak about the network society and how this network society in that sense is been coming from the technology, and for that sake we have to see that these technological aspect in that sense, appropriateness of this technology in that sense is going to be important. I think to bring Gandhian debate on development, we can say that the Indian model in that sense, which was been putting efforts towards the Gandhian model, has been now seen universally. So, the basic idea in that sense of course is that do we have the Indian value system in that sense which can be seen as the role model for the other nations in that sense in terms of the developmental model. We have to have the concern for the sacrifices, we have to have the concern for reducing our greeds of our needs in that sense as such, and that is the way in which we can see that we can speak about the true sanitation. So, I think somewhere we try to see that the sanitation has not to be seen simply in terms of the arrangement for the toilets or the pits in that sense. Rather, we have to see that the provisions have to be seen across, and it is vis-a-vis the ecosystem, it is vis-a-vis the surrounding in that sense as such, it is the ecology which has to be taken into consideration, and since the environment is nobody's, so we have to see that these forms of sanitation in that sense has to be emphasized, and the basic idea in that sense of course is that if we try to speak about that, we are somewhere trying to have a certain amount of universal values, and for that I think we try to see that we had many times found that certain arrangements are there whereby it is leading to some war situations in certain specific regions, but it does not mean that it is not going to affect the other regions. I think sooner or later we have to have certain repercussions of these arrangements, but the most important thing in that sense of course is can we develop that sensibility, can we develop that particular aspect of skills in that sense whereby the people should understand the cause for others, and we have to see that these causes are to be located in terms of being empathetic towards the other community, towards our neighborhood, towards the others in that sense, and if that happens then only we can see that the concern for the issue of sanitation in that sense is going to be seen as meaningful. So, I think somewhere we try to see that these arrangements which I was just discussing, it tries to not only include the various facet, but the most important thing in that sense is starting from the formal to the informal, to the from individual to the community, or trying to move from the biotic to abiotic. All the things in that sense have come into the picture. We try to see that the medical component of sanitation in terms of the health, or we try to see the community participation in terms of the people in that sense are going to play a crucial role, and the most important thing in that sense is that we try to speak about these particular facts when we try to speak about that how the different countries in that sense across is going to look into or take into consideration the issues of sanitation. I think the United Nations in that sense is working hard, although we try to see that there are various countries which tries to represent through that particular body, and they are being benefited out of the issue of sanitation in that sense, or the issue of sustainability, or the issue of water, in terms of the food grain supply and many other things in that sense. And parallelly we have the international organizations like the World Bank, which are meant for providing certain basic amenities or the financial supports in that sense. But apart from that, we have also the World Health Organization, which tries to provide the facilities directly and indirectly related to the health for the different sectors or for the different countries in that sense. But the most important thing in that sense, of course, is that it has to be seen as the mutual support, which is going to be very important. So, somewhere we have to see that the societal phase of the sanitation in that sense plays a very crucial role. And if we try to speak about the societal phase of sanitation in that sense, which of course can be seen as one of the biggest form of sanitation, because when we try to speak about the societal, it includes your concern for gender, it includes the concern for the specific age groups in that sense, it tries to speak about the concern for the region, either it is rural or urban, or sometimes we try to see that these arrangements in that sense are going to be seen as in terms of providing the bridges between the different nations. So, that way I think the most important concern which we have to face is that we have to speak about the forms of sanitation, which is quite varied. I think the arrangements which we try to make out are basically meant for having a certain amount of understanding about how we have to see things globally. It is not Indian specific, like initially when we try to speak about the history of the trajectory of the sanitation across the globe, we try to see that across globe the issue of sanitation in that sense had been seen in varied forms, and that way we try to see that certain good practices which we can see in other nations in that sense, can we borrow them or sometimes what are the good practices that we can lend to the others in that sense, and that is where we try to have the win-win situation. And the most important aspect is that we have to speak about that how as I was saying earlier, that the next war in that sense can be the war on water, and we have to see that can we be in a position to fight against that particular issue, because it is not across the nation in that sense which is important, it is basically the concern which has something we have to fight with regard to the resources. The resources are meager in that sense, but the only thing in that sense of course is that how we are going to safeguard ourselves through the specific hygiene conditions, how we are going to have the proper disposal of the excreta, or sometimes we have the provision for the safe drinking water. But at the end of the day, we have to see that the wider or the entire world's population in that sense have to be safeguarded with these arrangements. I think it is not target specific. We try to speak about the Millennium Development Goal, which has set an agenda, and the concern for sanitation, the concern for proper water supply is there, and we try to see that in the coming future we try to have the outcome of these things in terms of 2035. But the whole idea in that sense of course is that to what extent we are going to plead for that and how we are going to take up this particular issue as the mega agenda, that is going to be important. It is not that we are simply trying to see it in terms of Magna Carta. I think legally or technically speaking, we have to speak about the fact that how this arrangement which we are trying to speak about should not be seen as compulsive. It should not be seen as something which has to be seen as legal. I think it has to come from within, it has to come from one's own in that sense, and if that happens, then sometimes we can speak about the fact that how it is going to bring about certain important concern. So, friends, I think when we try to speak about the forms of sanitation, the basic idea is that we have to deal with certain important components. We have to speak about the legal and the sanitation, we have to speak about the medical and health and sanitation, we have to speak about the concern for gender and sanitation, we have to speak about the concern which is related to the issue of what you can say the state, the role of the state and sanitation in that sense. And apart from that, I think there are many other things which we can incorporate in this particular unit. We can speak about the role of the private agencies, but it is again the question of the accountability, or it is the concern for how much or to what extent we are in a position to justify. But definitely I think the role of the private players in that sense can also be seen as an advantageous position, when we try to speak about the forms of sanitation, but again we have to see that how much or to what extent it is going to be seen in terms of the welfareist understanding, and if that is the scene, then definitely we can speak about that it is going to bring about the transformation in the human understanding. So, if that is all, I think we can see that the forms of sanitation in that sense can have varied meaning, and that way I think we try to see that these are the ways in which we can understand the wider horizons of sanitation. So, friends, thank you, and I hope that this particular arrangement in that sense with regard to the form of sanitation is going to bring about the new thought processes in you, and please try to see what are the other ways in which we can link up the issue of sanitation vis-a-vis the other categories. So, thank you for this, and we will continue our further deliberations in the coming units. Thank you from my side for this particular deliberation. Thank you.